The blood on her hands was warm against the freezing Montana night as Clara Bennett knelt in the hay-strewn barn, her father's prize heifer laboring in a birth that had gone terribly wrong. Clara had seen difficult calvings before during her 22 years on the Bennett ranch, but never one quite like this, and never with her father laid up in bed with a broken leg and her brothers miles away driving cattle to the northern pastures. The heifer's eyes rolled white with panic, her breathing coming in sharp, desperate gasps that sent clouds of vapor into the lantern-lit darkness. Clara's own breath came just as fast, her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to remember everything her father had taught her about breech births and twisted limbs and the delicate balance between saving the calf and losing the mother. "Easy, girl," Clara murmured, her voice steadier than her hands as she felt inside the birth canal, trying to understand the tangle of limbs she found there. The calf was positioned all wrong, one leg bent back, the other jutting forward at an angle that would never allow passage. Sweat beaded on Clara's forehead despite the November cold that seeped through every crack in the barn walls. She had stripped down to her work shirt, her sleeves rolled past her elbows, her auburn hair escaping its braid in wild tendrils that stuck to her damp neck. The barn door crashed open with a gust of wind that nearly extinguished the lantern. Clara's head snapped up, her heart leaping into her throat, her free hand instinctively reaching for the rifle that leaned against the stall post. Montana Territory in 1885 was no place for a woman alone at night, even on her own land. Rustlers and drifters moved through these parts like shadows, and the Bennett Ranch sat far enough from town that screams would carry nowhere but into the indifferent darkness. But the figure that filled the doorway was no rustler. Even backlit by moonlight, Clara recognized the broad-shouldered silhouette, the distinctive tilt of a worn Stetson, the easy stance of a man who had spent more time in saddles than in chairs. Jake Cordell, the drifting cowboy her father had hired 3 months ago to help with the autumn roundup, stood framed in the doorway with snow dusting his shoulders and concern etched across his weathered face. "Saw your light from the bunkhouse," Jake said, his voice a low drawl that carried the dusty warmth of Texas. "Figured something was wrong." He stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind him, and crossed the barn floor with long, purposeful strides. His boots crunched on scattered straw, and Clara caught the scent of leather and wood smoke, and something indefinably masculine that made her acutely aware of how alone they were. "Breech birth," Clara said, forcing her attention back to the laboring heifer. "The calf is twisted up something awful. I cannot get the legs straightened." Frustration roughened her voice, and she blinked against the hot sting of tears that had nothing to do with the cold. This heifer was her father's pride, a purebred Hereford he had bought with money saved from 2 years of good beef prices, and losing her would break more than his bank account. Jake knelt beside her without hesitation, his presence solid and reassuring in the flickering lamplight. He smelled of the outdoors, of horses and open sky, and when his shoulder brushed hers, Clara felt a warmth that had nothing to do with exertion. She had noticed Jake Cordell from the first day he had ridden onto the Bennett Ranch, his belongings tied behind his saddle, his gray eyes steady and measuring as he asked her father for work. She had noticed the way he moved, graceful and deliberate, the way his rare smile transformed his serious face, the way his hands gentled skittish horses and mended broken fences with equal competence. "Let me take a look," Jake said, and there was no condescension in his tone, no suggestion that Clara was failing at something a man could do better. He simply offered help one rancher to another, and Clara found herself shifting aside to give him access. His hands were large and capable, scarred from years of hard work, and he moved with a careful precision that spoke of experience. He closed his eyes as he examined the calf, his face a mask of concentration, and Clara watched the play of muscles in his forearms, the way his jaw tightened when he found what she had described. "The front leg is bent back at the shoulder," Jake said after a moment. The other one is trying to come through, but without both legs forward, the calf is stuck tight. He opened his eyes and looked at Clara, and in the lantern light she saw intelligence and kindness and a bone-deep weariness that made her wonder what roads had led him to Montana. "We need to push the calf back in, give us room to work the bent leg free. It is going to take both of us, and it is going to be hard on the mother." "She is strong," Clara said, though she was not sure if she was trying to convince Jake or herself. "Tell me what to do." What followed was an education in trust and teamwork that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. Jake talked her through each step with a patience that never wavered, even when the heifer kicked and bellowed, even when Clara's arms trembled with exhaustion, even when it seemed impossible that they would ever untangle the mess of calf and cow and bring forth life instead of death. He positioned her hands, guided her movements, and when she had to push deep inside the birth canal to shove the calf backward, his hand covered hers, adding his strength to hers, his breath warm against her ear as he murmured encouragement. "That is it," Jake said when Clara's fingers finally found the bent leg. "Feel where the shoulder joint is. You need to cup the hoof in your palm, protect the mother from getting torn up, and bring that leg forward. Slow and steady. You have got this." Clara bit her lip hard enough to taste blood as she worked, her entire world narrowing to the feel of bone and muscle and the slick wetness of the birth canal. Her shoulders screamed in protest, her back ached from kneeling on the hard-packed floor, and her fingers cramped around the tiny hoof she could barely grasp. But Jake's voice was a steady anchor, and his hand on her shoulder was a reminder that she was not alone in this fight. "I have got it," Clara gasped, and then with a surge of triumph, "I have got it." "The leg is coming forward, easy now," Jake cautioned, but she could hear the smile in his voice. "Bring it through nice and smooth. You are doing fine, Clara, just fine." And then, miraculously, impossibly, the leg straightened, and suddenly both front hooves were where they should be, and the heifer gave a long, guttural bellow and pushed with renewed strength. The calf slid free in a rush of fluid and membrane, landing in the straw in a tangle of wet limbs and floppy ears. It was not moving. Clara's heart plummeted. They had come so far, worked so hard, and now this. She reached for the calf with shaking hands, but Jake was already there, clearing the membrane from its nose and mouth, rubbing its chest with firm, vigorous strokes that looked almost rough. Clara held her breath, the silence in the barn so profound she could hear the hiss of the lantern flame, the rustle of mice in the hayloft, the thunder of her own pulse in her ears. The calf took a shuddering breath, coughed, and then bleated, a thin, querulous sound that was the most beautiful thing Clara had ever heard. The heifer answered with a low, anxious moo, and Jake laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy that transformed his usually solemn face. He sat back on his heels, his shirt soaked with birth fluids and sweat, his hair plastered to his forehead, and looked at Clara with something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "You are a natural," Jake said, and the words were simple, but the way he said them, with wonder and respect and something warmer, made Clara feel like she had roped the moon. She ducked her head, suddenly shy, and turned her attention to the calf as it struggled to stand on legs that seemed too long and too wobbly for its body. The heifer was already on her feet, nuzzling her baby with fierce maternal devotion, and Clara felt tears prick her eyes again. But this time they were tears of gratitude and exhaustion and a strange, swelling happiness that had as much to do with the man kneeling beside her as with the new life they had brought into the world. "I could not have done it without you," Clara said, and when she looked up, Jake was watching her with an intensity that made her pulse skip. His face was close enough that she could see the silver threading through the dark stubble on his jaw, the laugh lines at the corners of his eyes, the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He smelled of sweat and animal and something essentially masculine, and Clara found herself leaning toward him before she even realized she was moving. Jake reached out, his calloused thumb brushing across her cheekbone, and Clara realized he was wiping away a smear of blood or birth fluid or perhaps a tear she had not known she was shedding. His touch was gentle, reverent almost, and when his hand lingered, cupping her face with a tenderness that seemed at odds with his rough exterior, Clara felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been locked away for so long she had forgotten it existed. "You did the hard part," Jake said, his voice rough, and then he was pulling back, breaking the spell, rising to his feet with an easy grace that made Clara's heart ache with longing. "We should clean up, get these two settled for the night. Your father will be pleased to hear his heifer pulled through." Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and busied herself with the practical tasks that followed a difficult birth. They worked in companionable silence, spreading fresh straw, checking the heifer for tears or injuries, making sure the calf nursed and the bond between mother and baby was strong. Jake moved with an efficiency born of long practice, and Clara found herself stealing glances at him when she thought he was not looking, memorizing the way lamplight played across his features, the competent movements of his hands, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a stove. When the work was done, and the barn was settling into the peaceful rhythms of livestock sleep, Jake walked Clara back to the ranch house through snow that had begun to fall in earnest, fat flakes that melted on her upturned face and caught in her eyelashes like tiny stars. The world was hushed and white, the kind of silence that only comes with fresh snow, and Clara felt the events of the night settling around her like a warm blanket. "Thank you," she said when they reached the porch steps, and the words felt inadequate for what she wanted to express. "For helping. For knowing what to do." Jake tilted his head, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. "Anytime," he said simply, and then after a pause, "You really were something tonight, Clara. Your father has every reason to be proud of you." He turned to go, and Clara felt a desperate urgency rise in her throat. "Jake," she called, and when he turned back, she blurted, "Will you come to supper tomorrow? I am making pot roast, and there is always too much food for just me and Pa with the boys gone." A slow smile spread across Jake's face, crinkling the corners of his eyes, and Clara felt her stomach flip. "I would like that," he said. "I would like that very much." Clara watched him walk back toward the bunkhouse, a dark figure disappearing into the swirling snow, and pressed her hand against her chest where her heart was beating a wild, hopeful rhythm. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, did not know if the feeling she had seen in Jake's eyes was real or imagined, but she knew with absolute certainty that something had changed tonight. Something profound and irrevocable, born in blood and sweat, and the shared miracle of bringing life into a cold Montana night. She went inside to find her father awake despite the late hour, propped up in his bed with a book he had not been reading. Thomas Bennett was a big man gone gaunt with pain, his legs splinted and elevated, his weathered face creased with worry that smoothed when Clara came through the door. "The heifer?" he asked without preamble. "She is fine, Pa," Clara said, and she could not keep the smile from her voice. "Mother and calf both. It was breech, twisted up bad, but Jake helped me get it straightened. The calf is nursing, strong as anything." Relief washed over her father's face, and he sagged back against his pillows. "Jake Cordell," he mused. "I knew I did right hiring that man. He is a good hand, one of the best I have seen, knows his way around cattle like he was born to it." "He does," Clara agreed, feeling warmth rise in her cheeks. "I invited him to supper tomorrow. I hope that is all right." Thomas Bennett was no fool, and Clara saw understanding dawn in his eyes, followed by something that might have been approval or might have been concern. "Clara," he said carefully, "Jake Cordell is a drifter. I like him fine, trust him with the stock and the land, but he is not the settling kind. When the snow clears and spring comes, he will ride out just like all the others before him." Clara lifted her chin, a gesture of defiance her father knew well. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe not, but that is tomorrow's worry, Pa. Tonight I am just grateful he was here." She kissed her father's forehead, banked the fire in the stove, and climbed the narrow stairs to her room under the eaves. The window looked out toward the bunkhouse, and she could see a light burning there, a small yellow square in the darkness. She wondered if Jake was lying awake as she was, replaying the events of the night, feeling the ghost of her touch on his hands the way she felt the echo of his thumb on her cheek. Clara had been courted before, of course. At 22, she was considered nearly too old for marriage by the standards of some, but there had been offers. The banker's son in town, who had soft hands and softer prospects. The neighboring rancher, a widower twice her age with 3 children and a desperate need for a mother more than a wife. A cowboy from the Circle K who had written her terrible poetry and tried to steal kisses behind the general store. She had turned them all down, unwilling to settle for anything less than the kind of partnership she saw in the rare good marriages around her, the kind where husband and wife stood back to back against the world. But Jake Cordell was different. She had sensed it from the beginning, had seen it in the way he treated the horses, the way he spoke to her father with respect but never servility, the way his eyes followed her across the yard when he thought no one was watching. He was a man with secrets, with a past he did not discuss, but Clara had grown up reading cattle and horses and land, and she thought she could read Jake Cordell too. She saw loneliness in him and honor and a deep well of longing for something he had convinced himself he could never have. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, Clara dreamed of calving barns and gentle hands and gray eyes that saw her not as a rancher's daughter or a potential wife or a woman to be protected, but as an equal, a partner, someone capable of miracles. The next day dawned clear and brutally cold, the kind of cold that made the snow squeak underfoot and turned breath to ice crystals in the air. Clara woke early, as she always did, and went through the morning chores with unusual care. She fed the chickens, gathered eggs, checked on the heifer and her calf, and found both thriving in the weak winter sunlight that streamed through the barn's east-facing window. The calf was already steadier on its feet, already showing the sturdy build that promised it would grow into a fine addition to the herd. She returned to the house to make breakfast for her father, who was in better spirits despite his immobility, and then spent the morning on household tasks that she usually resented but today found almost pleasant. She baked bread, the yeasty smell filling the kitchen with warmth. She peeled potatoes and carrots for the pot roast, seasoning the meat with care and setting it to cook slowly on the back of the stove. She even changed her work dress for a better one, a dark blue calico that brought out the copper in her hair, and spent more time than usual pinning up her braid and making sure no stray wisps escaped. Her father watched these preparations with knowing eyes but said nothing, and Clara was grateful for his discretion. She was nervous enough without having to explain feelings she barely understood herself. Jake arrived promptly at 6, knocked on the door with his hat in his hands and his dark hair slicked back with water. He had shaved, Clara noticed, and changed into a clean shirt, and the effort he had made touched her deeply. This was a man who lived out of a bedroll, who owned little more than what fit in his saddlebags, yet he had taken care with his appearance for her. "Come in," Clara said, and was proud that her voice did not shake. "Supper is ready." The meal was one of the most pleasant Clara could remember. Jake had an easy way of talking that drew out stories without seeming to pry, and Thomas Bennett responded with tales of the early days of the ranch, of blizzards and cattle drives, and the slow, patient work of building something out of nothing. Jake contributed his own stories, carefully edited Clara suspected, of drives up from Texas, of wild horses in New Mexico, of 100 small ranches and 1,000 campfires under an endless sky. Clara listened more than she spoke, content to watch the two men find common ground, pleased by the respect that flowed both ways. Her father was testing Jake, she knew, asking questions that seemed casual but were designed to reveal character and intention. And Jake, whether he realized it or not, was passing every test, displaying a combination of competence, humor, and fundamental decency that made Clara's heart swell. After supper, Thomas Bennett excused himself, claiming fatigue, though Clara suspected he was giving them privacy. She and Jake washed the dishes together at the big kitchen sink, their hands brushing in the soapy water, their shoulders touching in the narrow space. The intimacy of it, the domesticity, felt both strange and utterly right, as if they had been doing this for years instead of for the first time. "Your father is a good man," Jake said as he dried a plate with a threadbare towel. "You are lucky to have him." "I am," Clara agreed. "Though he drives me to distraction sometimes with his stubbornness. He should not have tried to fix that barn roof alone. That is how he broke his leg, you know. Insisting he could do it himself instead of waiting for the boys to come back." Jake chuckled. "Independence runs in the family, I am guessing." Clara felt herself blush. "Maybe so." She scrubbed at a pot with more vigor than necessary, suddenly nervous about where this conversation might lead. "Jake, can I ask you something? Anything? Why do you drift? You are too good with cattle, too skilled with horses and land to not have your own place. What keeps you moving?" The silence stretched long enough that Clara thought she had overstepped, had asked something too personal, too probing. But when she glanced up, Jake was staring out the window at the darkening sky, his expression distant and a little sad. "I had my own place once," he said finally. "Down in Texas, near the Brazos River. Not big, not fancy, but mine. Built the house with my own hands, ran cattle on land I knew like the back of my hand." He paused, his jaw working. "I had a wife too, Mary. We were married 3 years before the fever took her. Took our baby daughter too when she was barely 6 months old." Clara's heart clenched. She set down the pot and turned to face him fully, waiting, giving him space to continue or not as he chose. "After they died, I could not stay," Jake said, his voice rough with old grief. "Everything reminded me of them. The house we built together, the land I had planned to pass down to our children, the whole damn future I had imagined. So I sold it, packed up what I could carry, and I have been moving ever since. Figured if I never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots, I could never lose anything that mattered again." "Oh, Jake," Clara whispered, and she reached out without thinking, her wet hand covering his. "I am so sorry." He looked down at their joined hands, and when he looked up again, his gray eyes were bright with unshed tears. "That was 5 years ago," he said. 5 years of drifting, of working other men's ranches, of telling myself I was better off alone, and I believed it, Clara. Right up until last night, when I walked into that barn and saw you fighting for that calf with everything you had. And I thought, here is someone who understands. Here is someone who knows what it means to hold life in your hands and refuse to let go." Clara could not breathe, could not think, could only feel the weight of what he was saying, the vulnerability he was offering her. "I do understand," she said. "My mother died when I was 12, pneumonia. I watched my father break and then slowly, painfully, put himself back together. He did not have the luxury of leaving, of running away from the memories. He had 4 children and a ranch and responsibilities that would not wait for grief. So he stayed and he survived, and eventually he learned to be happy again. Not the same happy as before, but happy nonetheless." "You think I should stop running," Jake said, and it was not quite a question. "I think you should stop running from the wrong things," Clara said carefully. "Running from pain, from memories, from loss that makes sense for a while. But if you are also running from the possibility of joy, from connection, from love, then you are letting the fever take more than it already has." Jake was silent for a long moment, his hand still under hers, his eyes searching her face as if looking for answers to questions he had not yet asked. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. "And if I stopped running," he said quietly, "would there be a reason to stay?" Clara's heart was beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. "There might be," she said, and was amazed at how steady her voice was, how sure. "If the right person asked." "Clara Bennett," Jake said, and her name on his lips was a prayer and a promise. "I am not a man with much to offer. I have got a horse, a saddle, and enough saved to maybe start over somewhere if I was careful. I have got a past that still hurts and a tendency to keep my feelings locked up tight. But if you would have me, if you would give me a chance to prove I can be more than a drifter, I swear I would spend every day trying to be worthy of you." Tears were streaming down Clara's face now, hot and fast, and she did not bother to wipe them away. "You are already worthy," she said fiercely. "And I do not need promises of what you will be, Jake Cordell. I want you exactly as you are, scars and grief and wandering soul. I want the man who helped me save a calf in the middle of the night and looked at me like I was capable of anything." And then she was in his arms, or he was in hers, and it did not matter who moved first, because they were kissing with a desperate hunger that 5 years of loneliness and 22 years of waiting had built between them. His mouth was warm and demanding, his hands cradling her face as if she were something precious and fragile, and Clara felt like she was falling and flying at the same time. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "I am staying," he said, and it was a vow. "If your father will keep me on, if you will have me around, I am staying, no more drifting, no more running." "He will keep you on," Clara said with certainty, "and I will definitely have you around." They stood in the kitchen as the last light faded from the sky, holding each other as if they were the only solid things in a shifting world. Outside, the Montana winter pressed close, but inside there was warmth and light and the beginning of something neither of them had dared to hope for. The weeks that followed were among the happiest and hardest of Clara's life. Winter in Montana was unforgiving, and with her father still recovering and her brothers not due back until the spring thaw, the work of keeping the ranch running fell to Clara and Jake. They were up before dawn and working until well after dark, feeding livestock, breaking ice on water troughs, repairing storm damage, and doing the 100 other tasks that winter demanded. But the work was lighter because they did it together. Jake moved into the ranch house, sleeping in the small room off the kitchen that Thomas Bennett insisted he take, and the three of them fell into an easy routine. Clara cooked, Jake and her father planned the spring work, and in the evenings they sat by the fire and talked or read or simply enjoyed the quiet comfort of companionship. The romance between Clara and Jake deepened with each passing day. They stole kisses in the barn when they thought no one was looking, held hands on evening walks through the snow, and talked for hours about everything and nothing. Jake told her about his childhood in Texas, about a father who had been tough but fair and a mother who had died young. Clara shared her own memories, the good and the bad, and found in Jake a listener who never judged, never dismissed, never tried to fix things that could not be fixed. Thomas Bennett watched their courtship with approval tinged with melancholy. One evening in late December, when Jake had gone to check on a mare that was close to foaling, Thomas called Clara to his bedside. "You love him," he said without preamble, and it was not a question. "I do," Clara admitted, seeing no point in denying what was written all over her face. "And he loves you. That is plain enough for anyone with eyes to see." Thomas shifted in his bed, wincing at the pain in his leg. "I am happy for you, Clara girl, truly I am, but I need to know, are you prepared for what comes with loving a man like Jake Cordell?" Clara frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean he is a good man, maybe one of the best I have known," Thomas said carefully. "But he is also a man with ghosts. He has known loss, deep and terrible loss, and that kind of pain does not just disappear because he has found something new to love. There will be days when the grief comes back, when he pulls away, when the past feels more real than the present. Are you strong enough to stand by him through that, patient enough to give him time to heal at his own pace?" Clara considered this, thinking about the shadows she sometimes saw in Jake's eyes, the way he would go quiet and distant when something triggered a memory of his lost family. "I am strong enough," she said finally, "and patient enough. I am not expecting him to be perfect, Pa. I am expecting him to be human. We all carry scars. The question is whether we let them define us or whether we find someone who loves us despite them." Thomas smiled, pride and sadness mingling in his expression. "You are your mother's daughter," he said. She would have liked Jake, I think. Would have seen in him what you see. I think she would have too, Clara said softly on Christmas Eve. A Chinook wind came through, warm and strange, melting the top layer of snow and filling the air with the smell of wet earth and pine. Clara made a special dinner, roasting one of their precious chickens and baking an apple pie with the last of the dried apples from the root cellar. They ate by candlelight, the small house filled with warmth and laughter, and afterward Jake produced a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. "It is not much," he said, almost shy as he handed it to Clara. "But I wanted you to have something." Clara unwrapped it with trembling fingers and found a pair of leather work gloves, supple and beautifully made, with her initials tooled into the cuffs. "Jake, these are beautiful," she breathed. "Where did you find them?" "I did not find them, I made them," Jake admitted. "Used to do leatherwork in my spare time back before. I thought maybe you could use a pair that actually fit instead of wearing your father's cast-offs." Clara pulled on the gloves and flexed her fingers. They fit perfectly, molding to her hands like a second skin. She looked up at Jake, her vision blurring with tears. "They are perfect," she said. "Thank you." She had a gift for him too, a new shirt she had sewn from fabric she had bought in town weeks ago before they had even acknowledged what was growing between them. Jake held it up, admiring the neat stitches, the careful work, and then he did something that surprised them both. He pulled off his old shirt right there in the kitchen, unself-conscious in his union suit, and put on the new one. "Fits like it was made for me," he said with a grin, and Clara laughed, happiness bubbling up inside her like champagne. That night, after Thomas had gone to bed, Clara and Jake sat on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in a quilt and watching the stars wheel overhead. The Chinook wind had blown the clouds away, and the sky was a vast dome of black velvet scattered with diamonds. "I have been thinking," Jake said, his arm around Clara's shoulders, "about the future. Your brothers will be back in the spring, and your father will be back on his feet. They will not need a hired hand anymore, not really." Clara's heart clenched with sudden fear. "Are you saying you are leaving after all?" "No," Jake said quickly, tightening his hold on her. "No, I am saying the opposite. I am saying I want to talk to your father about buying some land adjacent to the ranch. There is that section to the east, the one that borders the creek. It has been sitting empty since old McAllister died, and I heard in town that his widow might be willing to sell. I have got enough saved to make an offer, maybe build a small cabin, start my own herd with a few head your father might be willing to sell me." Clara pulled back to look at him, her eyes wide. "You want to start your own ranch? Here." "If you think it is a good idea," Jake said, suddenly uncertain. "I know it is not much, starting from scratch like that, but I am not afraid of hard work. And I thought if I had my own place, if I could show your father I was serious about building a future here, then maybe..." "Maybe what?" Clara prompted when he trailed off. Jake took a deep breath. "Maybe he would not think I was too much of a drifter to marry his daughter." The world seemed to stop. Clara could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the warmth of Jake's body through the quilt, could smell the pine and leather and the indefinable scent that was uniquely him. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she whispered. "Not yet," Jake said, and he cupped her face in his hands, his gray eyes serious and full of love. "Not until I have something to offer you beyond good intentions and a willingness to work myself into the ground, but I am telling you that I want to, that I am planning to. That every decision I make from here on out is about building a life that is worthy of you." "Jake Cordell," Clara said, and her voice shook with emotion, "I do not need you to build anything to be worthy of me, you already are. But if you want to buy land, if you want to start your own place, I think it is a wonderful idea. And when you are ready to ask me properly, the answer is going to be yes." They sealed it with a kiss that tasted of promise and hope and the sweet, terrifying vulnerability of opening your heart to another person. Above them, the stars burned cold and bright, and somewhere in the barn a horse whinnied softly, and the world felt full of possibility. The winter gave way to spring with the reluctance of a miser parting with gold. March brought more snow, April brought mud and wind, and it was not until early May that the land finally shook off its white shroud and began to green. The Bennett boys returned from the northern pastures, lean and weather-beaten and full of stories, and Thomas Bennett finally shed his splints and began hobbling around the ranch on a cane, his leg healed if not quite as strong as it had been. Jake had already bought the McAllister land by then, having struck a deal with the widow that was fair to both parties. He spent his spare time clearing brush, marking out where the cabin would go, and dreaming aloud to Clara about the future they would build together. She helped when she could, riding over to his land in the evenings, her horse picking its way along the creek path while the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. They built the cabin together through the long spring days, with occasional help from Clara's brothers and grudging assistance from Thomas Bennett, who had decided that if his daughter was going to marry a former drifter, he might as well make sure the man had a roof over his head that would not blow away in the first strong wind. It was a small cabin, just 2 rooms and a loft, but it was solid and true, built with hands that knew their work and hearts that were full of hope. On a Saturday in late June, when the wildflowers covered the meadows in carpets of blue and yellow and the creek ran high with snowmelt, Jake asked Thomas Bennett for permission to marry Clara. They stood in the ranch yard, 2 men of different generations but similar character, and Thomas looked Jake up and down with the measuring gaze of a stockman evaluating a purchase. "You will be good to her," Thomas said, and it was not a question. "I will," Jake vowed. "I will spend every day of my life making sure she never regrets saying yes. And when the grief comes back, when you remember the family you lost and the pain feels fresh, you will not shut her out. You will let her help carry it." Jake swallowed hard. "I will try," he said honestly. "I cannot promise I will always get it right, but I promise I will try." Thomas nodded slowly. "That is all any of us can do." He extended his hand, and when Jake took it, the older man's grip was firm and warm. "You have my blessing. Take care of my girl and welcome to the family." The wedding was held on the first Sunday in July, in the small white church in town with half the county in attendance. Clara wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in a trunk in the attic, the lace yellowed but still beautiful, the satin still lustrous in the sunlight that streamed through the church windows. Jake wore a new suit, stiff and uncomfortable, but the look on his face when Clara walked down the aisle made every penny spent on fabric and tailoring worthwhile. They spoke their vows in voices that shook with emotion, promising to love and honor and cherish until death parted them. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife and Jake kissed her, Clara felt like she was sealing not just a marriage but a promise to herself, to always be brave enough to choose love even when it was risky, even when it meant opening herself up to possible loss. The reception was held at the Bennett Ranch, with tables set up in the yard and food enough to feed an army. There was music and dancing, and Clara whirled through the evening in Jake's arms, feeling young and beautiful and infinitely blessed. Her father danced with her too, his leg still a little stiff but his smile bright with happiness, and her brothers toasted the couple with whiskey that burned going down and brought tears to everyone's eyes. As the sun set and the guests began to drift away, Jake lifted Clara onto his horse and swung up behind her. They rode to their new cabin in the gathering dusk, his arms around her waist, her back pressed against his chest, neither of them speaking because there were no words adequate for what they were feeling. The cabin waited for them, small and sturdy, with curtains Clara had sewn hanging in the windows and furniture they had built or bought or been given as wedding gifts. Jake carried her over the threshold, a tradition he insisted on even though Clara laughed and told him it was silly. And then they were alone in their own home for the first time, husband and wife, partners in every sense of the word. That night, they learned each other in the way that married couples do, with tenderness and passion and occasional fumbling that made them laugh even as it made them gasp. Jake was gentle with Clara, attentive to her needs and her inexperience, and Clara found a confidence in his arms that she had not known she possessed. When they finally lay tangled in the sheets, exhausted and satisfied, Jake pressed a kiss to her forehead and murmured, "I love you, Clara Cordell." And Clara, who had dreamed of this moment even when she did not dare believe it would come, whispered back, "I love you too, always." The first year of their marriage was not easy. Building a ranch from nothing was backbreaking work, and there were days when Clara wondered if they had taken on more than they could handle. Jake worked himself nearly to exhaustion, clearing land, building fences, and slowly growing his herd with cattle bought cheap and raised with care. Clara divided her time between helping Jake and helping her father, who was getting older and less able to manage the heavy work of ranching. But there were good moments too, sweet and shining, that made the hardships bearable. Evenings spent on the porch watching the sunset, their hands linked and their bodies tired but content. Sunday dinners at the Bennett Ranch, surrounded by family and laughter. The first time they sold cattle at a profit, and Jake swept Clara up in his arms and spun her around, both of them giddy with relief and accomplishment. And there were the moments when Jake's past rose up to haunt him, just as Thomas Bennett had predicted. The first time it happened, Clara woke in the night to find Jake's side of the bed empty and cold. She found him outside, sitting on the porch steps with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. It was the anniversary of his first daughter's death, and the grief had ambushed him in his sleep. Clara did not try to fix it or tell him everything would be all right. She simply sat down beside him, wrapped her arms around him, and held him while he cried. When he could speak again, Jake told her about his baby girl, about her tiny fingers and the way she had smiled in her sleep, about the fever that had taken her so fast there had been no time to say goodbye. "I am sorry," Clara said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "I am so sorry you lost her. I am sorry you lost them both." "I feel guilty," Jake admitted, his voice raw, "for being happy now, for loving you, like I am betraying them somehow." "You are not betraying them," Clara said firmly. "Loving me does not mean you love them less. Your heart is big enough for both, Jake, and I think wherever they are, they would want you to be happy." It was not a magic cure, but it helped. And slowly, over the months and years that followed, the bad days came less frequently. Jake learned to talk about his first family without breaking down, to share memories of Mary and the baby with Clara. And in doing so, he wove them into the fabric of his new life, rather than keeping them locked away in a separate, painful compartment. In the spring of 1887, Clara discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but she waited to be sure before telling Jake. When she finally did, over supper one evening, he went very still, his fork halfway to his mouth. "You are certain?" he asked, and Clara could not read the expression on his face. "As certain as I can be," she said, watching him anxiously. "I know it is frightening, given what happened before, but Jake, I am healthy and strong, and we will get through this together." Jake set down his fork very carefully, stood up, and came around the table to kneel in front of Clara. He pressed his face against her stomach, his arms wrapped around her waist, and she felt the shudder that went through him. "I am terrified," he admitted, his voice muffled against her dress. "I am so damn terrified of losing you, of losing another child. I do not know if I could survive it." Clara ran her fingers through his hair, her own fear warring with determination. "You are not going to lose me," she said, "and we are not going to lose this baby. We are going to bring a healthy child into this world, and we are going to raise them on this land, and they are going to know they are loved beyond measure." The pregnancy was not easy. Clara was sick for the first 3 months, unable to keep much down, and the summer heat made her swell and ache in ways she had not anticipated. But she was strong, stubborn, and determined not to let fear dictate her experience. She worked as long as she could, scaled back when her body demanded it, and submitted to being fussed over by both Jake and her father with as much grace as she could muster. Jake was a wreck. He treated Clara like she was made of spun glass. insisted she rest far more than necessary, and woke up multiple times a night to make sure she was still breathing. His anxiety was understandable but exhausting, and Clara finally sat him down in September when she was 7 months along and tired of being coddled. "I know you are scared," she said, taking his hands in hers. "I am scared too, but you cannot spend the next 2 months expecting the worst. You have to trust that my body knows what it is doing, that I will tell you if something is wrong, and that we are going to get through this together." "I am trying," Jake said, and the anguish in his voice made Clara's heart ache. "Try harder," she said, but gently. "This baby is going to be born into a house full of love, not a house full of fear. I need you to believe that everything is going to be all right, even if you have to fake it sometimes." Jake took a deep breath and nodded. "I will," he promised. "For you, I will." Clara went into labor on a cold November night, almost exactly 2 years after the night she and Jake had delivered the calf together. The irony was not lost on either of them. The pains started in the late afternoon, mild at first, and by the time the sun set, Clara knew the baby was coming soon. Jake rode to town to fetch the doctor and stopped at the Bennett ranch to let Thomas know. When he returned with the elderly Dr. Hastings, Clara was pacing the cabin floor, her hands pressed to the small of her back, her face set with determination. The doctor examined her, pronounced that everything seemed normal, and settled in to wait with the patience of a man who had delivered hundreds of babies. The labor was long and hard, lasting through the night and into the early hours of morning. Jake stayed by Clara's side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, and murmuring encouragement even though she could see the fear in his eyes. When she screamed, he flinched, and when she cursed him for doing this to her, he apologized and meant it. Finally, as the first light of dawn crept through the window, Clara gave a final, wrenching push and felt the baby slide free. There was a moment of terrible silence, and Jake's face went white, but then the baby cried, a lusty, outraged wail that was the most beautiful sound Clara had ever heard. "It is a boy," Dr. Hastings announced, holding up the red, squirming infant. "A big, healthy boy. Congratulations." Jake was crying, tears streaming down his face as the doctor placed the baby in Clara's arms. She looked down at their son, at his tiny, perfect features, his shock of dark hair, his fists waving in indignation, and felt a love so fierce it took her breath away. "We did it," she whispered, looking up at Jake. "We did it." Jake cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, gentle and reverent. "You did it," he corrected. "You were amazing. You are amazing." They named the baby Thomas after Clara's father, with the middle name of Samuel for Jake's own father. Little Tommy, as they quickly began calling him, was a good baby, healthy and strong, and he thrived under the care of 2 parents who loved him desperately. Watching Jake with their son was a revelation for Clara. She saw the fear in him gradually give way to wonder, saw him learn to hold Tommy without terror, to change diapers and rock him to sleep and sing lullabies in a rough, tuneless voice that nonetheless soothed the baby. And she saw him heal, saw the wounds left by his first family's deaths begin to close as he allowed himself to love again without reservation. Thomas Bennett was a doting grandfather, riding over to the Cordell cabin several times a week to spoil his grandson shamelessly. Clara's brothers were equally besotted, and Tommy grew up surrounded by love and laughter, by men who taught him to ride and rope, and by a mother who taught him to be kind. As the years passed, the Cordell ranch prospered. Jake's hard work and Clara's good management paid off, and they gradually expanded their herd, bought more land, and built a reputation for raising quality cattle. They had 3 more children, 2 daughters named Catherine and Rose, and another son they called Michael. The cabin was expanded, became a proper house, and the land that had seemed so raw and wild when they started was gradually tamed into productive pasture. Jake never completely lost the shadows in his eyes, but they faded, became part of who he was rather than the defining feature. He spoke of Mary and his first daughter to his children, made them part of the family story, and taught his sons and daughters that love was not a finite resource, but something that grew to accommodate whoever needed it. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jake gave Clara a locket with pictures of all 4 children inside. "I wanted to give you something that represented what you have given me," he said as he fastened it around her neck. "A family, a home, a reason to stay." Clara touched the locket, feeling the weight of it against her chest. "You gave me the same things," she said. "And you gave me something else too. You showed me that courage is not the absence of fear but the willingness to move forward despite it. That night in the barn when we delivered the calf, I was terrified I would fail, that I would lose the heifer and the calf both. But you believed in me, and that belief gave me the strength to keep trying. You would have saved them without me," Jake said. "Maybe," Clara allowed. "But it would not have felt the same. Having you there, having you trust me and work alongside me, that is what made the difference. And that is what marriage is, I think. 2 people facing the impossible together and somehow making it possible." They were standing on the porch of their home, the home they had built with their own hands and filled with their own love. Below them, the land stretched out in rolling waves of grass, dotted with cattle that bore their brand. In the house behind them, their children were asleep, safe and warm. And beside her, holding her hand as he had held it 1,000 times before, was the man who had ridden into her life on a cold Montana night and stayed. "You are a natural," Jake said, echoing the words he had spoken so long ago in a lamplit barn. "At ranching, at motherhood, at loving." "At all of it," Clara smiled, leaned her head against his shoulder and looked up at the stars that wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. "We both are," she said. "We just needed to find each other to figure it out." And as they stood there together, surrounded by the life they had built from nothing, Clara thought about the girl she had been that November night, young and scared and fighting for a calf's life. She thought about the man who had appeared out of the darkness to help her, who had seen in her something she had not known was there. And she thanked whatever fate or fortune had brought them together, had given them the courage to love again despite their losses, had blessed them with children and land, and a future that stretched out bright and full of promise. The years continued to unfold, bringing the usual mixture of joy and sorrow, triumph and hardship. There were droughts that tested their water resources, hard winters that took a toll on the cattle, and the inevitable sorrows that come with living in a hard land. Clara's father died peacefully in his sleep in 1895, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, and Clara mourned him deeply even as she was grateful for the years they had shared. But there were far more good times than bad. Tommy grew into a serious, capable young man who took to ranching like he had been born to it. Catherine had her mother's fire and her father's quiet strength, and she shocked everyone by announcing at 16 that she intended to become a teacher. Rose was the baby for several years, spoiled by everyone, until Michael came along and stole the title. The Cordell Ranch became known throughout Montana for the quality of its beef and the integrity of its owners. Jake served on the local Stockmen's Association, helped organize community efforts to deal with predators and disease, and became the kind of man others looked to for advice and leadership. Clara raised their children, managed the household, and still found time to help with the ranch work, though as she got older she had to admit that some tasks were better left to younger backs. On a summer evening in 1902, when Jake was 47 and Clara was 41, they sat on their porch and watched their grandchildren play in the yard. Tommy had married a lovely girl from town, and they had 2 children of their own, a boy and a girl who visited the ranch every chance they got. Catherine was teaching in a school in Helena, but came home for summers and holidays. Rose and Michael were still at home, teenagers now, navigating the difficult years between childhood and adulthood. "Did you ever imagine this?" Clara asked, gesturing to the scene before them. "When you rode onto my father's ranch looking for work, did you think you would still be here 17 years later?" Jake considered the question seriously. "No," he admitted. I thought I would work the winter, maybe stay through the spring gather, and then move on like I always did. I never imagined I would find a reason to stay, let alone that the reason would be you. I am glad you did stay, Clara said. I am glad you walked into that barn that night. I am glad you helped me save that calf. I am glad for all of it, even the hard parts. Me too, Jake said, and he reached for her hand, his fingers automatically finding hers in a gesture so familiar it was like breathing. You know what I remember most about that night? Not the birth, though that was remarkable. Not even the moment I knew I was going to fall in love with you, though I could probably pinpoint it if I tried. What I remember most is the way you refused to give up. The heifer was in distress, the calf was stuck, and you were tired and scared, but you kept fighting. And I thought, this is a woman who understands what it means to hold on when letting go would be easier. I learned that from my father, Clara said. He used to say that ranching was 90% stubbornness and 10% luck. You needed the luck to get started, but the stubbornness to keep going when the luck ran out. Wise man, Jake said. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the evening breeze carried the scent of grass and cattle and home. In the yard, their grandchildren shrieked with laughter, chasing each other in an endless game of tag. Inside the house, Rose was practicing piano, the notes drifting out through the open windows in a melody that was almost right. Michael was probably reading, as he usually was, lost in some book about history or exploration. This was the life Clara had built, the family she had created with a man who had once believed he would never love again. It was not perfect, was never without its challenges, but it was theirs, earned through hard work and sustained by love that had been tested and proven true. Do you still think about them? Clara asked quietly. Mary and the baby. Jake did not answer right away, and when he did, his voice was thoughtful rather than sad. Yes, he said, but not the way I used to. It used to be that thinking about them felt like opening a wound that would never heal. Now it is more like remembering a dream, something beautiful that was real but is not anymore. They were part of my life, an important part, but they are not my whole life. You and the children are my life now. I am glad you can remember them without it hurting so much, Clara said. Me too, Jake agreed. And I think I owe a lot of that to you. You never made me feel like I had to choose between honoring my past and embracing my present. You made room for all of it, for all of me, and that is a gift I can never repay. You do not have to repay it, Clara said. That is what love is. Making room for each other, all the messy, complicated, wonderful parts. As the stars began to appear in the deepening sky, Clara thought about the girl she had been at 22, alone in a barn with a laboring heifer and no idea that her life was about to change forever. She thought about the choices she had made, the risks she had taken, the leap of faith required to open her heart to a drifting cowboy with a tragic past. And she thought about the words Jake had spoken that night, words that had seemed simple at the time but had come to mean so much more. You are a natural. Not just at delivering calves, though she had proven that true over the years, but at loving, at building a life, at holding on when letting go would have been easier. They had both been naturals, she realized. Natural survivors, natural fighters, natural lovers. They had just needed to find each other to fully become who they were meant to be. The children grew older, left home, and built lives of their own. Tommy took over the running of the ranch as Jake's joints began to stiffen and his energy waned. Catherine married a lawyer and moved to Billings but visited often. Rose became a nurse, following in the tradition of women who healed and helped, and Michael surprised everyone by becoming a veterinarian, the first in the family to attend university. Jake and Clara grew old together, their faces weathering like the land they had worked, their bodies slowing but their love remaining constant. They celebrated 50 years of marriage in 1935, surrounded by children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren. And Jake gave a toast that made everyone laugh and cry. 50 years ago, he said, his voice still strong despite his 78 years. I was a man with nothing to live for but the next job, the next town, the next sunset. And then I walked into a barn and met a woman who was fighting to save a calf in the middle of the night. And everything changed. She showed me that life was not something to be endured but something to be embraced, that love was worth the risk of loss, that putting down roots was not a trap but a blessing. I have spent the last 50 years trying to be worthy of her, and I figure I have got about 50 more years to go before I get it right. Clara stood up, her own 72 years sitting lightly on her shoulders, and kissed him to the cheers and applause of their family. "You have been worthy from the beginning," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You just did not know it yet." They danced together that night slowly and carefully, their bodies remembering the steps even if their joints protested. And as Clara rested her head against Jake's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, she felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful in its intensity. This was what she had fought for that long-ago November night. Not just the life of a calf, though that had been important, but the possibility of life itself, of connection, of love that could survive loss and hardship and the simple, relentless passage of time. She had refused to give up, had kept fighting when giving up would have been easier, and in doing so she had saved more than a calf, she had saved herself. And she had saved Jake too, though neither of them had known it at the time. Jake died in the spring of 1938, peacefully in his sleep with Clara beside him. He was 83 years old, and he had lived more than twice as long after meeting Clara as he had before. His funeral was attended by what seemed like half of Montana, by ranchers and businessmen and family members who had come from as far away as Texas to pay their respects. Clara stood beside his grave with dry eyes and a heart full of gratitude rather than grief. She missed him, would miss him every day for the rest of her life, but she could not be sad about a life so well lived, a love so completely realized. They had been given 53 years together, had built a family and a legacy, had proven that second chances were possible, and that love could bloom even in the hardest soil. She lived another 7 years, staying in the house they had built, helping Tommy run the ranch and watching her family grow and prosper. She told stories to her great-grandchildren about the old days, about the wild and beautiful Montana territory, about a cowboy who had ridden into her life and stayed. And she told them about the night she had delivered a calf with that cowboy's help, about the way he had looked at her and said, "You are a natural," and how those 3 simple words had changed everything. Clara died in the winter of 1945 at the age of 82, surrounded by family and at peace with the life she had lived. She was buried next to Jake, beneath a shared headstone that bore their names and the dates of their births and deaths, and beneath that, an inscription that Tommy had chosen, "You are a natural." The ranch continued on, passed down through generations of Cordells, and the story of Clara and Jake became part of the family lore, told and retold until it took on the quality of legend. But those who heard it knew that every word was true, that love like theirs was rare but real, that courage could be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with guns or fists but with stubbornness and hope, and a refusal to give up even when the odds seemed impossible. The barn where it had all begun was eventually torn down and rebuilt, but a piece of the original timber was saved and incorporated into the new structure, a reminder of that cold November night when 2 souls had found each other in the midst of struggle and had chosen to hold on, to keep fighting, to believe in the possibility of miracles. And on quiet nights when the wind blew down from the mountains and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, those who listened carefully swore they could hear echoes of that night. The low moan of a laboring heifer, the murmur of encouraging voices, and beneath it all, the steady beat of hearts learning to love again. It was a story of the Wild West, of hard land and harder lives, of men and women who carved homes out of wilderness and families out of loneliness. But more than that, it was a love story, pure and true, The kind that endured because it was built on a foundation of respect and partnership, and the absolute certainty that together they could face anything. Clara Bennett Cordell had been a natural, just as Jake had said. Natural rancher, natural mother, natural lover. But more than any of that, she had been a natural fighter, someone who saw what needed to be done and did it, who held life in her hands and refused to let go. And in holding on, in fighting for that calf on a cold Montana night, she had found everything she had ever wanted and more than she had ever dared to dream. She had found love, family, and a legacy that would outlast them all. That was the real miracle, the one that mattered more than any calf safely delivered or any ranch successfully built. Two broken people had found each other in the darkness, had chosen to trust and to hope and to try again. And from that choice had come a love that would echo through generations, inspiring those who came after to be brave enough to open their hearts even when it was risky, to fight for what mattered even when it was hard, and to believe in the transformative power of love. The Wild West was full of stories of gunfights and cattle drives, of outlaws and lawmen, of fortunes won and lost. But the best stories, the ones that really mattered, were the ones like Clara and Jake's. Stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, not because they were heroes but because they were human, flawed and frightened and full of love. And in the end, that was what endured. Not the violence or the hardship or the struggle, but the love. The love that had started in a lamplit barn with a cowboy and a woman and a calf that needed saving. The love that had grown and deepened and sustained them through 53 years of marriage. The love that had created a family, a home, a legacy. That was the story worth telling, the one worth remembering. And as long as there were Cordells on the land Jake and Clara had claimed, as long as there were people who remembered to fight for what mattered and to hold on even when letting go would be easier, that story would never die. It would live on, generation after generation, a reminder that the Wild West was not just a place of violence and conquest, but also a place of love and hope, and the indomitable human spirit that refuses to give up, no matter how long the night or how difficult the birth or how uncertain the future. Clara had been a natural, but then again, so had Jake. So were they all, every person who had ever loved enough to risk loss, who had ever fought for something that mattered, who had ever looked at the impossible and said, "I can do this." They were all naturals, every one of them. They just needed someone to believe in them, to help them see what they were capable of, to stand beside them in the darkness and say, "You have got this." That was what Jake had given Clara that November night. And that was what Clara had given Jake in return every day of their lives together. Belief, trust, love, and in the end, that was all anyone ever really needed.